from relevance in terms of the PC hardware was just getting so much more powerful, so much more modular. So I always had this incredible affinity for Commodore from, my second computer in '82 up through the point that it just didn't become viable for me anymore. So that's how I drifted away from Commodore as being an ongoing purchaser, owner, What did it seem like from inside the company? How did you watch it lose its prominence?
I can't say, I wouldn't say that Commodore lost its prominence. What happened is that the PC just took over. Because I don't understand why Commodore actually stayed in the PC business as long as they did. And let me tell you something, this is really astounding. I actually, as I said, I worked in America for 1 year, and that was in 1992. And when the first day I walked into the offices in Westchester, I went to see the engineers, because as far as I'm concerned, without the engineers we didn't have a business. And I went to see them, and there were seven Amiga engineers, and there were 40 PC engineers. And we had just had a new head of engineering, a guy called Bill Sidness, who came from IBM, and his claim to fame was he was the guy behind the PC Junior, which is considered the biggest flop in history. And what happened was that as soon as he joined Commodore, he gave jobs to 40 of his mates. Now, why in 1992 would you even consider making your own PCs? You'd buy them, you'd buy them OEM from the Far East, your design in facial terms, your CBM logo on it, and then you wouldn't carry all the inventory. You take orders and place it. That's how you run a business. But Commodore didn't do things like that, and they never had a business plan. But obviously what happened is that the PCs, and this was at a period of time, if you remember, when Intel used to eat its own young.
Absolutely.
Every 2 weeks they'd launch a new chip that would be much more powerful than the one they'd launched 2 weeks before, and it would be cheaper. And there were all these people holding zillions of inventory that became worthless overnight, became like fruit. But in spite of all of that, what happened, of course, is that the more machines that are out there, and they're all in effect compatible with each other, not always, but you know what I mean. It made it easier for the software companies to write it because they had a much bigger target audience. So I would say that because Commodore still had its fans and it was still selling well, but the PC just grew and grew and grew.
Yeah, for me, being a Commodore enthusiast, that was my PC. It was still very kind of hard to see the PC supplanting it. We didn't want that. We as the fans wanted to see Commodore succeed and to go on. I certainly felt, I was dragged kicking and screaming into Windows. I thought Workbench was far superior, far more pleasing. I even played around with OS2 Warp, things like that, anything just to avoid Windows. Mm-hmm. And then I finally drug myself out of Windows with Linux and gone for good. But it was always a curiosity to us of, the external user, the guy out there, the customer in the field, that we're now going, okay, we got to pay him $75, and we're going in and buying a Pentium 120 2 weeks later for half the cost. And it was always we had this sort of a sense of loss of that there wasn't a Commodore CPU on a shelf, that we couldn't upgrade that Amiga again to performance levels appropriate and comparable to the PC. So thanks for kind of sharing what it was like from the inside. That's an interesting perspective.
Yeah, and you've also got to remember that because Commodore never had a business plan, they opened the door for lots of companies to make peripherals for Amiga, companies like GVP, products like the toaster and that. But why Commodore didn't do them themselves, I don't know, because it was their proprietary technology. They could have made all that money. They didn't license it out. They didn't get any revenue from it. But they let other people take all the business. That doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. But instead what they did was they launched C16 and Plus 4 and all these ridiculous things that nobody ever wanted. They were good at that. Very good at that.
Did the three of you ever meet during the C64 and Amiga eras? Did your careers affect each other in any way?
No.
I don't think so. I was more of an Atari 800 person. To me, the Amiga
Keep swearing.
is like a no. To me, the Amiga is like a next generation Atari 800. It's basically the same but better, and it's just like Commodore kind of grabbed it. You know what I mean? At the last minute, it's like the ST should have been the Commodore machine. It's like they swapped over, because the 64 was nowhere near as good as the Atari 800, in my opinion.
Yeah, but who
I
cares?
disagree with
We
you.
sold. Who cares? We sold just under 27 million.
Yeah, but that, no,
So
what
that's
I'm,
my
what I'm
case.
saying is it is like the next generation of the Atari 800. It is. The similarities are there's so many similarities between the two machines, and you can tell it is a next generation of that machine. It isn't a next generation of the 64. Definitely.
No, but
yeah.
But you've got to remember that the Amiga was developed by a completely independent company, nothing to do with Commodore, nothing to do with Atari. There were some Atari engineers, I think, initially involved in, but the Amiga was not based on making an improvement on the 64 or anything else. It was an idea of custom chips that each did its own function. And so, and I'll just clarify the situation, because Jack Tramiel, who was the founder of Commodore, of course, around about March of '84 was thrown out. He was kicked out because he, at that time, it sold so many shares to bring money into the company. He ended up with only 6%, and Irving Guild was the chairman at 22%. They had a disagreement, which is outlined in the book. Yeah, and basically it was take it or leave it, and so Jack left. The first thing Jack did was he went to the guys making the Amiga, and they were desperately short of money. They were virtually broke, and he lent them $500,000, wrote them a check, and said, if you can't pay this back by X amount of date, I'll own the company. He then immediately went and he bought Atari for $1, because Atari owed so many debts, and of course he never paid anything back. You never do. So his objective was, get the Amiga and then buy Atari, and then Atari will market the Amiga. That was his plan. And at the time it took him to get the Atari deal finished, in the meantime Commodore had gone to Amiga and said, we can do a better deal than that, which they did. So when Jack went, he found out, he was furious. He said, I'm going to sue you guys, and they said, why? And he said, because I paid you the money. And they handed him his check back. They'd never cashed his check. And as I understand it, Leonard Tramiel has still got that check in a frame at home. But that's the truth. That's what happened.
Yeah. What I meant was that the machine, you could just tell it's the next. The hardware is so similar. It's the next. If you're familiar with the hardware of the Atari 800, then it's the follow-on is definitely the Amiga. You can just tell.
One of the things that I would say about Commodore in the early days, you mentioned the 1541 drive. Did you ever use a 1540 drive? Because that came before it, with the VIC-20 or whatever, and it had the remarkable thing that if you wanted to use it with a Commodore, you had to turn the screen off because the speeds were running different speeds. So you had to sort of put the lines on the basic line and sort of poke this to turn the screen off, then load what you wanted, and then poke this, and you just put return down to get it to work. And they eventually replaced the chips in the 1540, and they made it 1541. But one of the things I would say about Commodore is that they were incredibly helpful. If you had a problem with something that didn't work, or something in their book that didn't do what it was supposed to do, you'd ring them up in Slough, was it, David? Yeah.
Slough initially, yeah.
I'd ring them up in Slough, and they couldn't give me the answer. They'd say, we'll call you back, and they always did, and they always gave me the answer. And I'm afraid I couldn't say that about Atari.
No.
Yeah. So I thought the Commodore 64 was a terrific machine to work with. I work more on the ST now. I've just finished a version 2 of Head Over Heels, which at the moment is on the ST, and I think that's a super processor, the 68000. It's the same in Amiga. It's a super processor to work with, and I really enjoyed working with that. But Commodore 64, at its time, I thought it was the best machine on the market. So that's my opinion, for what it's worth.
So Colin, you were at Ocean obviously for a good spell and did lots of work there, and can you tell us about some of the machines you worked on and what made maybe the Commodore stand out If it did.
Generally speaking, it was the Commodore. It was the Commodore. I was poached from a company called Software Projects. Matthew Smith and Get Set Willie and Manic Miner, things like that. I got a phone call from Ocean saying, "Would you like to come and join us?" And they made me an offer that I simply couldn't refuse. And they were a super company to work with. All the time I was with them, I was working predominantly on the Commodore 64. The last major project I did for them was Head Over Heels on the 64. And then they loaned me to another company for a while, Special Effects, which were in the Albert Dock in Liverpool, working on a Game Boy type thing or a Nintendo thing that didn't see the light of day, but I was there for quite a long time. In my spare time, to learn the 68,000 code that was on the ST, I produced the Head Over Heels version on the ST. Did that entirely at home off my own back, learned how to use the machine, and then took it to Ocean and said, well, there's no sound because I can't do that, but do you want it? And of course they said yes, and then it was fairly easy to put it onto the Amiga as well. So I started a version 2 in 1989, and then Ocean decided they were not going to produce home micro games anymore, and so I shelved it until 2000 and something, when we went to an Ocean reunion and my old boss said, what happened to it? You need to finish it. So it's been on and off. I've had some health problems and heart attack and things like that, but it is now eventually finished, and it is on show out there if you want to look at it. The Commodore machine was my favourite, still is. I think it was a terrific machine to work with. I think everybody that worked with it at Ocean, they called me Grandad and they called me Fossil. but it was me they came to if they wanted a problem sorting out. I was twice the age of all the other programmers. How I managed to get in there in the first place, honestly I don't know, because they were recruiting teenagers. We were all self-taught. You couldn't go to a university or a college and learn how to do machine code. You had to teach yourself if you wanted to do it, and we all did, and I'm really glad I did. I think I found the secret of a super life. I found a job I really enjoyed doing. Ocean paid me quite well, and they gave me super bonuses if I finished it on time and to specification. One of the happiest periods of my life.
One of your colleagues yesterday, Simon Butler, said that you were pioneers. There was nobody doing what you did, so you had no one to go and ask.
Yeah, exactly right. Simon's been a lifelong friend. I met him when I first went to Ocean, and I don't know if any of you have seen the Ocean book, but in there you'll find a picture, a caricature, if you like, of me made out as Robocop, and that was done by Simon Butler sometime in the 1980s, and I've still got a copy of it at home, and it catches my face. Hasn't changed much, but yeah, it's in the Ocean book, you'll find it.
So let me ask you this. At the time, certainly, at least in the US, the Apple was prevalent, the Commodore came along and just, in many cases, steamrolled it. The PC came along, steamrolled Commodore. Apple survived. They had always enough of a margin, and they were many times on the ropes, like in the 90s. Apple almost went out, and then they had the iMac revolution and the iPods and everything else. But here it is today. This is being recorded on a Mac. There's a Mac right there. So somehow, Apple threaded the needle and survived as a company, and went on to not just still make PCs with their own identity, but they went on to make a host of other products that we all know and carry in our pockets today. It's massive. I've always thought the Commodore could have been Apple. That we could have Commodore phones today instead of iPhones. What do you think would have had to have been done differently, and what would you have implemented if you could or were permitted to? Could Commodore have been Apple?
They should have put David into a different role, then they might have done.
Well, the thing is, as I said, they after Jack left, Jack was the driving force to the whole of Commodore, and whilst he didn't make always the best decisions, he did make decisions and he stuck with it. But once he'd left, Irving Gould, who as I said was the major shareholder and chairman, he just brought people in to run Commodore, and he brought people in who had no experience whatsoever. A vice president of Pepsi Cola came in and didn't know anything about the business. Now, I don't have a problem with that, But you would think that somebody at that level would go around to the subsidiaries and talk to people like me who are at the front line and say, what's happening, what do you need, what can we do, how can we help you? He never spoke to anybody. He'd make decisions ad hoc without having a long-term vision. And how can you run a business if you have no long-term vision? And again, I'll come back to the fact that they had no business plan. For the business plan, you could say, right, let's diverse. You know, we're making electronics, let's do this. But let's get into the mobile phone market, for example. Would have been perfect for that, because the Commodore distribution channels throughout Europe are massive, and they still are today. You can go in any store, and if you talk Commodore, people know about it. And so there's every chance that Commodore as a brand name could come back, and actually it's something I'm working on, but I won't talk about now. But yeah, I agree with you, but what you've got to remember, in my opinion, Apple was Steve Jobs. Without him, they didn't have any driving force at all, and he was the man.
Right,
And, you know, oh, absolutely, because you know when he left, they almost went under because they had no direction whatsoever. And he was a man of an incredible intellect and drive. And I mean, I don't know if you know, he's got a book of his quotes out. I don't know if they actually printed it, but there's a quote in there that I absolutely adore, and it's so true. And he says, "You don't hire smart people and tell them what to do. You hire smart people and let them tell you what to do." And that's his philosophy, and that's what I believe drives the business.
I'm actually glad it didn't become like Apple, because Apple back then, they had an open system, you had the OS source code was released, it was a much more open machine. You know, you could actually dive into the machine, you could take the back off, you could put your own stuff in there, they were helpful. It was a lot better than the Apple that is today. The Apple today is a monster, it's a horrible company. It's just like a dictator, and the stuff is like Fisher Price toys. It's just horrible. I'm glad that Commodore isn't like Apple now.
How much cohesion was there between the territories? You know, you were in the UK. How much did you work with the other territories? Because I know that you've said that Commodore was massively mismanaged, and you were managing part of it. So.
Each subsidiary did its own thing. We were never brought together. We had management meetings, and they would either be in London or they would be in Frankfurt, where all the general managers would get together. We'd be told very little. There was no opportunity really for us to put our heads together. There was a time when I was asked to take 2 or 3 of my people, and we went to Commodore France, and we basically showed them how to market and what to do. We did the same thing in Italy. But there was no cohesion whatsoever. And the other thing, which I think is very, very fundamental, is that not only did Commodore have no business plan, they never did any external auditing. So they were relying on the general managers or managing directors of each country to tell them what was going on. And a lot of it was lies. There was crooks. You know, Bernard Van Tienen, he's dead now, so I don't mind, I've told him to his face when he was alive, of course. But he was the biggest crook known to man. And what he used to do, as a good example, is that at the end of every quarter, if he hadn't got the figures that he'd said he was going to get, he would invent and write invoices, and he would send product on a truck for 5 days to come back into the next quarter. So on his books it showed he'd reached his figures, he'd get his bonus and his commission, and then 5 days later the product will come back in the stock again. He did that quarter on quarter, and he used to brag about it. Right? So if you have you imagine you've got no, but well.
Nobody was taking any notice, put it that way.
Well, yeah, exactly. Because they had no external auditing, which is ridiculous. So you've got companies all over the world, and you're at the mercy of whether that person's an honest person or not. It's absolutely ridiculous. So, and it's a shame, because I mean, I'm a huge believer in collaborating with other people, and I built my reputation is on collaboration with everybody, the software companies, everything. I'm renowned for it, because 10 heads are better than one. And if you can get people to agree on a consensus and they all buy into it, it's going to happen. But you know, for example, when we started doing the packs, for example, the Batman pack, and it was so hugely successful, much more successful than I ever imagined it would be. I said that we should be doing this in all the countries in Europe, because our audience was the same people, the same children, the same parents.
Same outlook.
Absolutely. So what we do is that when we have our pack design and we've done the negotiating, instead of buying 10,000 pieces of Batman from Ocean, we would buy 150,000 because we're buying it for the whole of Europe. When we got the artwork done, we'd have it done in different languages, send the art over to those countries so they get it printed in their own country to save transport costs. And we'd have one TV commercial for all countries where you'd just dub it. But they wouldn't do it. They would not do it. It's unbelievable.
Do you think they were almost successful by accident simply because they hit on some great standout machines, the VIC-20, the 64, the Amiga?
Yeah, I mean, if they had not got the Amiga, if they hadn't bought the Amiga, then in my opinion we wouldn't be around, because they simply were so poorly managed and in financial nightmare. But the Amiga, because the Amiga changed the whole face of computing, and let's be honest about it, it came and it influenced a generation of people. And what's amazing now is that all around the world there are people in high positions who owe it to the Amiga because they started on something that was easy to use. They could get into it very quickly, unlike the 64, which you had to put a lot in to get it out. And I think without the Amiga they wouldn't have been around. They really wouldn't have been around.
Did you have any difficulties at all at any stage with, say, Amiga games? Because not everyone had the same Amiga. With the C64 you knew exactly what they had and you could build a game for that precise platform. With Amiga, some had a meg, some had half a meg, etc.
You'd code for half a meg, but then you'd add extra features, or you'd have like a disk cache or something like that for the extra RAM. That's what I would do.
I presume
Same with the
same,
ST.
Well, although the machines were the same, I had an episode when I worked with software projects about a game that I produced, which was being sold in America. In fact, it didn't sell very well in this country because the hero of the game, Harvey Smith, decided to walk off with somebody else's wife the week that it was released, and nobody would stock it. Woolworth said no, and W.H. Smith said no. But anyway, after a month or so, my boss called me in while I was at software projects and said, in America they've got this big flicker at the top of the screen, which we didn't get in the UK. And it was down to the fact that they were using 60 frames a second instead of 50 frames a second, which we have in this country.
I always did a switch in mine, so I could test.
Well, we didn't have an STSP. Anyway, my boss says, can you fix it? I said, yes, give me an NTSC machine and I will. Oh no, we haven't got one. I said, we'd have to
Yeah,
get
but you
one.
could change it with a register on the Amiga.
No, I'm talking about the Commodore 64.
64, I think it was just you could mod the board, it's dead easy.
Well, if you could, I didn't know how to do it, nobody with me. I had to change the code around to do it, but I didn't have a machine that I could test it on. So what was happening was that I would make some changes that I thought might solve the problem, and then we'd spurt the whole thing across the Atlantic, and we'd say, try that. And this took a couple of months. It was like judging a beauty competition over the telephone. That's really what it was like. But you know, we got there eventually. But yeah, so something you have to be aware of. They've got different frame rates in the USA than we have here, and it does make a difference to those of you that understand the technical term, the flyback time. Yeah.
If you used things in America as well, you could use artifacts to get extra colours. If you used a black and white, you could do every odd and even lines to get a couple of extra colours.
Oh, right.
So a lot of games did that. That's why you saw games with stripes going down.
Yeah.
Whereas over here we have a PAL, and it was a lot harder work to work out before we looked at PAL. So it wasn't just every other line.
It's getting more technical now.
That's what happened on the Apple II. The Apple II had so many colours, even though it was just effectively a black and white screen, because he actually plotted specific dots in combinations to actually get colour rather than encoding.
So Colin and Anthony were at the sharp end, if you like, and working on different machines and seeing what the other machines were doing, and obviously they could compare that to Commodore. David, how much were you able to do that? Were you looking over your shoulder at the others, or looking ahead at some of the others in some cases? You know, particularly your main rivals with the C64 was the Spectrum and the Amstrad, the Atari ST, and how much were you able to kind of drive Commodore to overtake them?
Sorry about that. Well, I mean, I've got to admit something now. I did a calculation, back of the envelope calculation one day, about how many computers I personally have sold, not my team, me personally. And I estimated I've sold about 2.2 million, which is 16s and 64s and Amigas and plus 4s, so on. I never switched one on. I never played games. That side of it, and I think that's why I became good at being a marketeer, because I was marketing what the benefits of the product are, that, you know, what it'll do for you. If you want to know how it does it, I'll bring you a man who can tell you, or a lady who can tell you, right? And that's and the reason I'm telling you that is because I looked at my competition and I said, what are they doing to sell the product? Can I better it? So that was it. It wasn't about specifications, because, you know, if you have a product that is fantastic but doesn't sell, what's the point? And, you know, we know a few products that were being released, 3DO, for example, products like that, really good products, didn't sell. They didn't market them properly. So my reference point was always, how are they marketing? How can I outmarket them? How can I outsell them? And there's all sorts of things. I mean, I took the ST on personally, and the reason I did that was because when Jack Jamil bought Atari, he took a guy called Bob Gleadows, who was his right-hand man, with him. And my first boss at Commodore, when I joined the consumer division, was a guy called Paul Welch, and he joined Atari as well. So, and I'd had a big falling out with Paul, and he eventually got fired, which is another story. But the bottom line is that when I took the ST on, and I said, I'm going to outmarket them. And one of the things that I did was, I've always believed that the independent dealers are the salt of the earth. They are our backbone, because they look after people who've got problems and technical problems. Dixon's and Comet and Curry's haven't a clue. So I wanted to support the independents. Now, we never sold directly to independents because we didn't want thousands of little accounts. So we had 5 distributors. We had 4 initially, and then I appointed Silica because they were Atari's distributor. And what I did is I introduced an incentive program where we put a number of points on every Commodore product. And if the dealer reached a certain number of points, we took them on a fantastic trip, holiday. The first one we did was to Mexico City and Acapulco, because it was around the Amiga theme. I mean, we could have taken them to Spain, but everybody goes to Spain, so we made it better than that. And the fact of the matter is that we put on such a bloody good trip. Everything was incredible. That I think it was 36 dealers on the first trip. As soon as they got back, they'd gotten on to all their mates saying, "Oh, you don't know what you missed." So we put more trips on. And every time anybody went into a dealer store and said, "I want an ST," they said, "No, you don't. You want an Amiga." And we absolutely outsold them. That's marketing. That's what I do, and that's what anybody who's a good marketer, you look outside the circle and say, "What can I do that's a little bit different?"
As a programmer, you get to see all of the machines that everyone will be making before they're released. So you sign NDAs and things like that. So you know, and you get invited to feedback on what should we do next. In Atari and Commodore, around the time the Mega Drive and the SNES were under NDA, I got invited to the Atari Lynx preview, and they said, right, on the STE, which is also being released, what do we do after that? What does everyone want next? And a lot of people in the audience were crying out for higher resolutions and things like that. But I mentioned we want what these new machines are getting. We want character map screens so we can do arcade games. Yeah, that's what we want. And they just never did it. None of them. And I think that was the beginning.
Didn't even try to.
Didn't even try. And that was the good thing about the 64.
Yeah,
you use a character map screen to do as much scrolling as you want. We want lots and lots of parallax character map screens and loads of sprites.
Yeah.
We don't want high resolution. We want high colour resolution. We don't want lots of high resolution. And so we can port all these arcade machines, and that's what sells machines. And they just didn't listen, and I think that's beginning of the end, because after, it wasn't out to do with PCs, the beginning of the end was the SNES and Mega Drive. that was the end of the games
And the consoles, yeah.
industry for people doing homebrew games and things like that. That was, and creativity. That's when creativity went. If Commodore had brought out a character map screen machine, we wouldn't have had the SNES, the Mega Drive taking so much of the market, and they just didn't listen. And we knew what was coming out, and they didn't, because they would never be able to be privy to that information. We told them, we said, these are the machines that are coming out, and this is what we want. And that's why they were so successful. Yeah.
But it's like, as I said before, because Commodore never ever did any research, they didn't come to all of us.
They did research, because I went to some Commodore things, and they asked us what we wanted, we told them, and they didn't listen.
Well, all I can tell you then is that if there was ever any research done, it didn't include marketing, which is
Oh no, they weren't
we're
very
talking about technical specifications.
technical
there.
stuff. We said, what do you want?
This is what we want as programmers to do the
Yeah,
games
yeah.
that you want to see.
but,
Yeah.
and that's fantastic. That should happen. But if you don't ask the consumer what he wants,
It wasn't just Commodore. Atari were just as guilty as Commodore of doing this, because they did exactly the same. Because they were on the right track with the Lynx. The Lynx was great, yeah, in what it could do. And but the ST, they just on the Volca, they just did more higher and higher resolutions and just forgot about what we all said.
The 68,000 chip itself was designed by programmers. This is what we want. You know, we want all these registers. We want 32-bit and 16-bit address modes and things like that. And at least they did that. And for producers with the processor, it was a real dream to work with.
That kind of ties into what you said earlier. You hire smart people and they tell what you want to do, rather than asking the consumer what they want, because the consumer probably doesn't know what they want.
Yeah.
They just want to play games.
Yeah.
And that's why, you know, like on the Spectrum Next, the new machine, I think they've just added higher resolution character map modes, haven't they?
Yeah.
And they're actually listening to, I think, what people want. So instead of doing more high resolution screens, they just added more character modes, so you can do the parallax scrolling, I think. Is that
Yes,
right?
I don't know. I'm not a Spectrum man, but Jim Bagley, who's a very good friend of mine, he certainly is, and he's very impressed with the Spectrum.
And also, I think a lot of people are going onto that type of machine, because a lot of people doing games on that now are actually C programmers, but they're seeing how fast they can get things to run if they go back to assembly code, and how much fun assembly code is compared to C.
It's really great.
It's great. Assembly code is the best compared to C.
It's so simple, but you
100
need
times
million instructions to do something simple,
And
but
it's 100
it's
times
such
faster.
fun to write. Yeah, and 100 times faster. Yeah.
Easily.
So can you tell us about some of the kit that you were working on for game development? Was it just standard machines from Commodore that you got? Was there any
the
such
special
thing as a
machines
dev
from
kit?
I got an A3000 prototype. You could only tell the special ones because they're in black resin rather than white. You remember them?
Yeah.
So you could, if it was a new machine that no one had ever seen before, like a prototype, it was always in the black cheap plastic. And the same with the other ones. The other ones tended to do that, and I think the Mega Drive actually came out in a black cheap plastic. So.
I don't suppose David will know the answer to this, because I've been trying to find the answer to this for years and years and years. But in the days when we all had to use tape decks to load machines, and they didn't have to take ages, didn't they? You had a Commodore cassette deck, and you plugged it in, and if you're lucky, you're using a turbo loader that somebody had developed, and your game would load in minutes rather than half an hour. Except that sometime during that period, they changed the capacitor in the cassette deck, and half these tape decks wouldn't work anymore. They wouldn't load the games that we'd been selling for donkey's years. And we got to recognise them because somebody was responsible for a little orange sticker on a cassette deck that had been changed. You remember? Yeah? And I was one of those that was tasked with the job of getting a turbo loader that would work on one of these modified machines. But who the hell made the change, David? I bet you don't know.
Well, I don't know in that particular instance, but we had a guy based in Hong Kong called David Spires, and he was the procurement manager. And what I can tell you is that one day he changed our Commodore 64 power supplier, because I believe he saved 10 cents or something on each one, which when you're selling 1 million units is a lot of money. But those power supplies duly blew all the motherboards of every 64 that they were attached to, and it cost Commodore an absolute fortune because they had to replace all the motherboards. So saving 10 cents is not necessarily a great thing. I suspect it was him because he was there for a long time.
Yeah, all these cassette desks would work perfectly if you used the Commodore cassette system that was so slow. It was just the turbo loaders that various companies have developed that wouldn't work on these modified
You know,
ones.
there's a very famous saying, life is not meant to be easy.
On the Amiga, I did some disc mastering stuff on the Amiga, and you had GCR instead of MFM, so you could pack loads of stuff on the discs, but they wouldn't let us use it, even though the mastering people said it was fine. Trace and Ablex, Trace is in Chester and Ablex was near Birmingham, near Ironbridge. They would say it would work fine and they could mass produce it, but people at US Gold, they wouldn't let us use these high capacity discs, so everyone had to go back onto 2 discs, something like that. It was crazy, you know. And you could pack the bit cell size a little bit smaller as well, so they couldn't actually be copied on a regular drive. You'd have to use something called a cyclone or something like that on the Amiga to copy them. But US Gold weren't in for any of that, you know, all because of the mastering problems.
Yeah. And another problem I've come across with discs is that at one point I wanted to take the data that was on my ST discs that worked in an ST drive, and I wanted to put them onto a PC so that I could send to other people, and lo and behold, though I got a floppy drive that I could plug into my PC, it would not read these discs. And yet if I put the same files using the same floppy on the ST on a double-sided, double-density disc, then it would read it. Except that you simply can't buy double-sided, double-density discs anymore. At least I couldn't. I had to buy my last lot in the States, and then I went back for them and I couldn't get any more. A friend of mine has just given me 2 unopened packets, so I've got a supply. But exactly how they formatted are different. I mean, the ST reads them both. The PC will read one sort, not the other sort. I don't understand why. Maybe you know, Anthony.
It's not much of a difference. And I think you could click the disc a bit.
Well, no, I tried putting the other holes in and all the rest of it. I tried all that. It's just that the floppy won't recognise it. The floppy that's connected to my PC will not recognise that the disc is
You
there.
could probably read it in just write a direct driver, because it was a Western Digital 1772, we used on both the PC and the ST.
It's a lot
So it was
easier,
it was the same disk controller for reading floppy disks. So if you're at a register level, you would be able to read them. It was software, I would think.
Yeah,
It wasn't anything.
could be, but I did it eventually. I put it onto the right sort of disc, and now I can put everything onto my PC that I want to. But all these things, they all said to try us. You think, oh, just do this. This will be easy. My colleague in Canada, who's interested in marketing this game, he asked for a video of it. And now I've got the ST. That's what I've been running the game on. That's what I developed it on. And I have a SCART lead that goes into a television, which I brought with me here. And I thought, oh, this is very easy. I'll plug the SCART lead into an HD recorder and record the game. Except that, no, I couldn't, because when I did, I found that the mouse and the joystick were all severely affected just by this SCART lead being connected to the television. I couldn't understand it, and it only happens with modern televisions. There's something in the SCART connector. Eventually I put the whole thing onto an emulator and then recorded it from the PC. Anthony, yeah?
If I were you, I'd disconnect every wire apart from the red, green, blue and the sinks.
You're going all technical on me again.
So Colin, speaking of disk issues, I believe you had an issue with some discs that you had a copy of, is that right? You want to tell us about that?
Well, yeah, okay. This is quite an old story, but if you haven't heard it before, it is quite amusing. We had, this is while I was at Ocean, and we had a disc that had, and it was the only disc. It wasn't mine. I always keep backups, but it was somebody's disc, and it was the only disc with this particular data on, and somehow it had got misaligned. It wouldn't work in the drive properly, and we tried everything, and how on earth can we just get a copy of what's on this disc? And in the end, someone said, well, if we can find something thin and slippery and sort of just jam it between the two when we try and put it on the drive, maybe that would do it. So somebody found a Durex condom, and they stuck it in the middle of the hole, and lo and behold, it works. And forever afterwards, if you got the sleeve with that particular disc, it had written across the top of it, "Thank God for Durex." So that's the story.
Hey, never underestimate the value of some of those supplies. We were at a gaming expo, and we had some microphones that use small batteries, and we couldn't find these batteries in any store in England. So I go into the restroom, and I'm standing there looking at the wall, and there's a vending machine. I realize, man, that looks like it might have the right size batteries for what I need. And it did. So never underestimate the fixes you'll find in the men's room.
I tell you what, if you go into any store and buy a set of Christmas lights and then go back to the same store in 12 months' time to get spare bulbs, they won't have any because they've changed them all, you know. And that goes on year after year. Have you ever noticed?
Yeah.
You know, we have these built-in light things now that don't need changing, but it's a nightmare.
So Dave, I've got a question for you about specifically disk drive market share or whatever. In the US, the tape drive was almost a novelty that it was launched and very quickly supplanted. Tapes were special order, very rare to find. The disk drive just dominated. And you know, when I moved to Europe, I was surprised to find tapes on the shelves everywhere still, and you know, drives, you know, disk drives were, you know, less common. Anecdotally, you speak to anybody, so was the price and you know whatnot. Did you try to get the disk drives dominant over tape? Did you find that there was an affinity for tapes? What was your perspective from? I'm sure you would have loved to sell the more expensive disk drive over the tape. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, well, I think the problem was that, as you probably know, the disk drives are OEM, that Commodore didn't make them themselves, they were OEM, and therefore they were expensive, much more expensive than I think they justified for the increase in performance and the speed and everything over the cassette. And of course, in the early days, the Commodore 64 was a market that was perfectly suited to the socio-economic age group and financial situation of the families. And of course, the disk drive costs more than the machine, which didn't make sense. And therefore, it makes it very difficult. There isn't a performance gain measure that you can justify this extra price and what you get from it. So what we found was that most of the people buying 64s were parents with their children, and they put up with the C2N. That's all that they could do. It's hard for them to justify the extra expense, and because the 64 was used much more in a family environment and not so much in an office in the UK. So anybody who was in an office, they would buy the 5041. I think from memory, we were selling about 12% disk drives to 64s, something like that. And that was very hard to manipulate up or down, really.
I don't understand why the 64 drive was so expensive though compared to the Atari 810 drive, because effectively both of them had 6502 type processors in them, maybe probably 6507 or something like that put down them. And you had a data separator, and they both communicated over a serial line. Why did Commodore inflate the price so much?
Because our OEM, we didn't make them ourselves.
But it had your source code in there, everything was yours in there.
Well, yeah, because it's OEM, it's like a white label, isn't it? Basically?
Yeah, but well, why didn't you go down the Atari route and make them cheaper?
I have no idea.
Fair enough.
Not his department.
Fair enough. It would have been much more successful if you brought the price down to the level of the Atari drives, because they were always. I would say, look, if it's in the price of the Commodore 64 drive, it's not so expensive. No one would ever buy them here.
Yeah.
You know.
As I said, we had a lot of sales prevention officers.
Yeah.
So if I can ask each of you in turn, I mean, we're talking specifically about Commodore today, but what is it about this era, retro, classic, whatever you want to call it, that keeps us, well, we're sat here today talking about it. What is it, and is there anything specific about Commodore that brings back such nostalgia, do you think?
for me, I think the Commodore was the first machine that I was aware of that had these hardware sprites that was such a joy to work with, and you could do so much with them. All right, you could only have 8 of them and any one horizontal level, but we soon learned how to do things with that. And it always amazes me when I come to shows like this, and I come to quite a lot, the sheer number of people that are still so interested in the games that we were producing 30, 40 years ago. It amazes me. I'm afraid I haven't developed into modern games. I don't have a PlayStation. I've got a Wii machine that I use as a keep fit thing, that's all. I don't play games on it. I have to do a certain amount of exercise. So I haven't kept up with the game picture, if you like. I'm well aware that they've got loads more memory and much better graphics and much faster speed. Well, I was never much for one for games that required me to react quickly in the first place. I'm never any good at them. When I was writing Operation Wolf, I'd go into Lee Cowley, who was one of my games testers, come Gophers, and the question would be, Lee, please get me up to level 3, please, because I couldn't do it myself.
To me, it was all about getting the frame rate high, and that's kind of what the new retro sort of thing is now. Frame rate's high, doesn't matter about the resolution, make the games fun to play, simple, fun to play. I mean, they get overcomplicated when you get to PC type games. They're much more involved. They're not just pick up and play. And the old games used to be kind of pick up and play, and they used to be very fast. If you move the joystick, the character moved. It wouldn't be like 5 minutes later the character would move, which happens in a lot of PC games. Frame rate is very high, important on them games.
I would make one other point, is that the ST joystick that I use is comparatively small. It fits into the palm of my hand, and when I put this game onto an emulator so I could play it onto a PC, I can't use the keys. I want a joystick. Now, the joystick that I have to do that is this big, and it's got umpteen controls on it that I don't need, and it's much more difficult for me to manipulate. I can't play the game anything like as well with that joystick as I can on the Atari itself. I suppose I'll learn, but that's progress, isn't it, Anthony?
Yeah, for one of my games we were actually running out of buttons, so I actually did a hack for the Mega Drive joystick so you could use all the buttons on the Mega Drive joysticks on the Amiga.
I don't want to use, I want left, right, up, down and fire. That's all I need.
So sometimes you need 4 buttons and 3 buttons.
Yeah, I know. I don't mind. But why does it have to be this big?
I mean, I pondered about this retro thing, because nobody would have guessed. If somebody had said to me in 1994, how big the retro scene was going to be, I'd have
20
said,
years later.
I'd have said, what are you smoking? There's something wrong. But I think one of the reasons why Commodore is so well loved is because we were at that time with the 64. It was a low cost product, and it hit a generation at exactly the right moment in time. And the generation had been through the 60s of Britpop music and all of that stuff, and Beatles and all that. And they'd been a void for a long, long time. And when the home computer market hit, it was absolutely the right time. And so many of those people, who are, of course, all adults today, they remember how fun it was when they used to play these games. And I think also some games developers will probably hate me for this, but I think what has happened is in recent years, the games are more about the image of the game, the realism of the
characters.
Yeah, the characters. Not so much about the playability, because some of those old Commodore 64 games, they were just insanely playable. They didn't look great necessarily.
You just kept playing them. That was the thing.
Exactly, yeah. And just to put a final sort of touch on that, I think it was it August last year that the 64 Mini was released. I think it was August last year. They have sold over 250,000 already.
This is predominantly to people that had one before.
Yeah.
And you're right. Yeah.
It's staggering when you think about it.
On the Nintendo, Nintendo had like a kind of a fairly strict policy that the games had to run at 60 frames per second. So a good trick, what a lot of people used to do, programming wise, They'd put the interrupt vector, the 60 frames per second interrupt vector, they'd point that at the beginning of your game loop, and basically your game would reset 60 times a second, and you use a state machine, so you'd have a little value which said, where am I in the game, what point am I in the menus, I'm in the game. And so what you do is you'd reset your stack pointer, and then you'd start your game code again, and then you'd do all the most important things first, and then anything that really wasn't important you'd do last. And if it was missed on that frame, who cares? You'd have like maybe some part of an explosion moving. But if it didn't move, who cares? You know what I mean? But you do all your most important things first, knowing that it was always going to run at 60 frames per second, because as soon as it ran out of time, it'd reset and start again.
Don't you just love it when he gets technical about it?
That's what we used to do.
That's why he's here.
But that's how you guarantee, and you pass the Nintendo certification.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
And not pass the Nintendo certification for the deadline, you know, all your cartridges you'd miss your deadline.
It takes you back to the days of the old Space Invaders on the Atari consoles, when some of the little aliens would look differently because they hadn't got time to update.
Well, no, what you do on the Atari was on the there was a bug on the VCS. You could do the reset button at the same time as turning it on, and you get
Fire
two
twice.
bullets.
Yeah. So we can take some questions from the audience. Then we'll need to finish, and we can get out before the show closes. Anyone, just raise your hand.
Just going on about the C64 Mini. I know there's been some rumours about possibly an Amiga Mini, maybe. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, or what you could see that product being.
Well, I know the people behind the 64 Mini. It's Michael Batalana from Kleinfeld. But there is still a major problem with IPs and trademarks for the Amiga, because they're split all over the place, and they were it was like people digging into a bag of sweets and they grab something. I believe that is being resolved. I personally, I don't know of an Amiga Mini or something being released. I don't know of it. And I think I would know, because I know all the people involved, and they certainly, I'm in touch with them all the time. I would think it's more difficult only from a legal point of view to do that. There are people I know that are trying to reverse engineer all the Amiga chips, and that's not easy to do either.
Any other questions? Raise your hand. Yeah.
Yeah. Years ago, I saw a picture, and I always wondered whether it was actually kind of meant as a serious advert, or whether it was actually a bit of a Commodore's last stand. And it was basically there's a picture of Sega's headquarters, and it says, "To be this good will take Sega age," and it was a picture of CD32. Was that just actually a joke? Because it seemed just before that, just after that, Commodore disappeared. Was that kind of a farewell thing for?
No, not at all. In fact, I was responsible for that.
Sorry.
His fault entirely.
Yeah, what happened? I mean, sometimes I believe that there is a God, because we were forced into launching the CD32 6 months earlier than it was planned to be. I mean, up until that moment in time, the CD32 was the only product in the 12 and a half years I was with Commodore that they actually planned to do properly. And I got development kits into all the major software houses. We were writing software specifically for the CD32. Yeah, and everybody was writing for the CD32 to be launched in the sort of spring, summertime the following year. And then Medielli comes to me and says, well, you know, we're in financial trouble. I want to launch the CD32 so I get the extra sales. I want it before Christmas. And I said, you're absolutely mad. I said, we've got orders for all the 1200s that we can make. The orders were in place, and we'll ship them out October, November, December, Christmas. I said, what you'll do is you will kill the 1200, because people will say, I'm going to buy the 32 instead. I said, you will not get extra sales. I said, not only that, the software that will come out in the next couple of months will be just ported software, and people are going to be really annoyed. They've spent the money on a 32-bit machine, and the software is no different to the 1200. So anyway, he absolutely insisted. But what happened was that we launched at the Science Museum, which was a major coup. That was Dawn the Bat, my marketing manager. She got us that, which is a fabulous place to launch a new product. I chose September the 16th specifically, because we used this thing. All the invitations that went out were to retailers and to developers about the launch, and it said 16 will never be the same again. Right? Which is, if you think about it, it's clever marketing. Anyway, what happened was that about two or 3 weeks before we were due to launch the CD32, there was an article in one of the PC magazines, and I, for the life of me, can't find it now, which is annoying, because I can't remember which magazine it was, but it was real, and it was Tom Kalinske, who was the president of Sega, was being interviewed, and the guy interviewing him said, "What about 32-bit CD-based, games machines?" And he said, quote, "It can't be done. If anybody could do it, it would be Sega. We can't do it. That's not going to be done." I went, "Thank you, God." Right? So what we did is we got, as you might know, we had Chris Evans I got him to co-present with me when we launched the machine. But we had a voiceover done, a really strong American voice saying, if anybody could do it, it would be Sega, and that's literally word for word. And then, of course, we opened the smoke and mirror, as you do, and said, "Well, not only can it be done, here it is, and it'll be in your shops in 3 weeks' time," which is phenomenal. But then I got a phone call from a guy, and he said, "David," he said, "you won't remember me." He said, I've done some business with you before." He said, we've got all these poster sites." I said, "Do you remember?" And I said, "Oh, yeah." And he said, "As you know," he said, when somebody books a site, they pay 50% up front, and then 50% in the week that it goes up, whatever the advertising is." He says, I've got a really good deal for you." He said, "I've got 3 top location sites in central London that a guy's already paid the 50% and then now said they're not going to go ahead with it. So you could have them for the 50%. And he said, "Oh, and by the way, one of them's right outside Sega's head office." So we put it to I can't remember who actually came up with the strapline, but we put it to our advertising agency, and one of them, I think one of the guys from in there said, "As you know, Sega's advertising always used to be this good takes ages, to be this good, and they spin the ages around, take Sega. So they came up with this thing, to be this good will take Sega ages," because they'd said it. And we did, and I've got, it's in the book, it's a photo in the book of that 96 sheet poster site right outside Sega's head office. And the interesting thing was that Nick Alexander, who was the MD of Sega UK, we were all quite, I wouldn't say we were good friends, but we all used to be competitors, but we'd drink in the bar together at night. Every year we used to have this industry dinner at the Costa Hotel, which Rod Cousins used to organise, and it was a charity thing, Anyway, we were at this thing, and it was only like about a week after this site had gone up, and I'm there. I think we got 3 tables with all our people. Nick walks up to me and he says, "A bit close to home, Mr. Pleasance, a bit close to home." And I said, "Oh, well, where needs must, Nick, where needs must." And never another word was ever said, but they were seething. You've got to get lucky sometimes.
Yeah, there was the guy behind you.
Oh yeah, I was just thinking, we were talking about Atari, or Amiga being Atari, basically. If Atari had got the Amiga, would it have come out as a console, potentially? And what difference would that have made to the industry, do you think? To anybody, really.
I mean, it's conjecture, and who knows what they would have done with them. I mean, I have to say, I took my hat off to Tramiel and his team, because they produced the ST in a really, really short amount of time, and got it to market. And when what we did, I think we made the mistake of launching a pseudo business machine with the Amiga 1000 at a price point that could never be mass market. I think that was a mistake that we made. So what would have happened, I really don't know.
Well, they wanted it to be a console, didn't they? The company.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, I think we would be in a different world today. I think computers will be a lot better than what they are now. If the same team would carry on making the same advancements they were making, keep that team together, I think it would be completely different now. It would be years ahead.
Was there a question over here? Yeah.
Yeah, so, alright, I didn't want to stir it up, but...
You go ahead.
Do it anyway.
It's not really
David, I remember you once talking about the possibilities of what could happen, what could have happened, what was on the books development-wise. I don't know if you had a little sneak preview of what new computers could have been through Commodore, like new Amigos. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I think my biggest I guess you'd call it regret, about ESCOM buying Commodore is that it left behind, for some unknown reason, unrealistic reason, it left behind technology that was currently being developed by Commodore in Westchester, which I had the privilege of seeing. It was a chip being designed by a guy called Dr. Ed Hepler, and what he'd done is he'd taken a 3D RISC-based core, to which he added a Blitter chip, a 3D rendering engine. It had 5.1 surround sound stereo in it, which was state-of-the-art in '94. And they had it all cobbled together and showing it working in software, and it was mind-blowing. And there is nothing on the market today that comes close to it. And this was in 1994.
We were talking about this yesterday, weren't we?
Yeah, I mean, when you think that ESCOM just left it. And I actually met Dr. Ed Hepler again a couple of years ago. We did a presentation with a friendly company I'm with now in Philadelphia, and he came along to it. And he was a broken man because of it. You know, he'd done all this work and then it just got shelved. And it was phenomenal. I mean, I can't tell you what it was, just outstanding.
Yeah. The machines though now, being realistic, in your hand, in your phone, are many thousands of times faster than the old machines back then. So if the same teams were making the same evolutionary changes, I think things would be different now. But your machines now in your pocket are fast enough to emulate whatever could have been made back then. You know, they'd be even faster, even emulating them. No matter what you could dream up back then, whatever's in your pocket is faster. You know.
More power in your pocket than took us to the minute, didn't it?
Any other questions? Yeah, go on.
Can I just ask you, the advent, particularly for the coders, the advent of the internet, and obviously that's where a lot of people get their information now in regards to the secrets behind these machines and that. Have you found that, like, when you go back to the old hardware, or you go back to actually program for them, that it's a much easier job now nearly, because I sort of get the impression that you're sort of working in silos in various companies, whereby you would have people that knew certain tricks and that weren't shared with anybody else in the industry. Everybody's having to come up with their own dev tools, everybody's having to come up with their own maps and that. Have you found that lately, when you actually go to do stuff, that the internet or so is possibly what's bringing most people back into the scene, and that the wide sharing of knowledge of how all the hardware works, essentially?
I haven't kept up to date with internet technology, if you like, coding for the internet. I don't write in Java or any of those scripts.
I'm talking more about.
No, I think what he's referring to. Do you have maybe more information to hand now than you had then?
I think the information is there now. If I was to look up, could I have an instruction set, please, for the 6502? I'd find one online. And it would probably go into a lot more detail than what we were working with in the early 1980s. I mean, when we were at Ocean, we actually worked in a dungeon, in a crypt at the bottom of a church, and we had a tremendous technical team there. They put together. We used an ST to actually program on, and it was connected to whatever your target machine was, whether it was a Commodore or an Amstrad or a Spectrum or whatever, and you wrote the program, you assembled it, it spurted it across, and you could look at all the registers in your target machine while it was running. It was very, very clever. State of the art in those days. I wish I still had that system now, because I use DevPack on the ST, and it takes it maybe 2.5 minutes to assemble each time I try and use it, but I've worked with it. I'm sure the information is there on the internet, and I use the internet quite a lot to find out things that I don't know that I want to know, but I don't use it much in relation. I don't do that much programming now anyway. But Tony?
I had a doubled up clock speeded Amiga, and I had a destination Amiga, so I could assemble twice as fast with DevPack, and I wrote my own comms system to back and forth, so I could transfer data back and forth, so I could fully debug on the Amiga. But the things that is available now, we had closely guarded secrets back then, as to, say, on the ST, how to get some smooth scrolling working on the ST by messing with the syncs, and then basically...
Technical again.
But these things were quite hard to find out by then because it was all trial and error, and you had to get everything perfect for it not to jitter or something like that. But now you could probably find the information on the internet quite easily on how to do that kind of hardware trick. For instance, when John Burton was doing Leander on the Amiga, he came round to my house, and I'd done what's called the Impossible demo on the Amiga, and I had 16 colours on top of 16 colours, smooth scrolling, parallax, full screen, which is impossible on the Amiga. And because you haven't got enough time.
Just takes him longer, that's
right?
all.
No, there isn't enough time to actually grab the data from the memory. So I had that working, and he goes, "Oh, I could use that for the mountains in Leander." So he used that for, and it was like a closely guarded secret. But then he told the Shadow of the Beast people, they used it in Shadow of the Beast 3. You see, and so on and so on. And I never got credit for that, but there you go.
Have you ever thought about compiling any of this stuff online?
Well, on the old
some of the technical stuff you're telling us now.
Yeah, but it's all out there, and now if you want to watch the videos, people have done videos and stuff. Some of the stuff you still can't release it. I don't know who owns the rights to some of the stuff we've done. So, and if Signos is going, I don't know who. It's pretty difficult. You don't know who could come after you.
So the tricks you use to get that parallax scrolling working,
well, no, that's it. That's
that would be yours,
that is mine. I'm talking about some of the artistic stuff that was in it as well. But yeah, I can tell if anyone wants to know how to do all that kind of stuff.
They can ask you in about 2 minutes.
Yeah, like for instance, I reversed the boot code for the PlayStation. So when it says SEE at the bottom, you can whatever you want on there. You can have your own logo on there. Not a lot of people could do that back then. We did that. The same with cartridges for the Nintendo. How they check for the copy protection on the Nintendo is they check for the words Nintendo. Yeah. So what you do is on the first read, you have it say Nintendo, but the second read, when they actually display the thing, you actually have it say something else. So then it doesn't say Nintendo, so then you can release cartridges without Nintendo approval.
Right.
And same with Sega. Sega did the same thing. Just loads and loads of tricks used to
there's sites like GitHub where it's like a forum where people ask questions and other people answer, and that's very commonly used. So in answer to your question, it definitely has made things a lot easier, the internet. But on the other hand, the internet has been hijacked by 4 companies, and we are all slaves to them at the moment.
If you wanna, I was actually arrested for hacking in 2003. But if you want to see what I could have done on the Amiga, I've released on YouTube what I was working on, and I had like a full 8-way scroll working around that much raster time on the Amiga. Basically 60 frames per second, it was only using that much time, so I had the whole of the rest of the display to have run. You can see it on my YouTube channel.
What's that YouTube channel?
Just look up Sinister Soft or else me and Paul. You'll see it all. I've done my map editors on there that I used to use, and a couple of other things, just old stuff from. You've got to search right back to the beginning of the YouTube account. But yeah.
Why did you get arrested? For what?
I allegedly hacked Sky B, so everyone could watch Sky for free. And then I allegedly hacked
allegedly
BT Cellnet, so people could just turn off their phone and turn on their phone and get the money back on their phone. But I didn't do it.
No. Why are we sitting next to you?
So, you remember the whole evolution of the PIT cards and the battery-powered Sky cards?
Well, there's other stuff in there. You can actually turn on real cards. There was one on this. I'm not going to say I did this, but this is what you could have done. There was the Sky had basically the Sky 7 series card. You could videotape, and then you could cancel your contract, and you could basically play the signal back through the box, and you could turn your card back on, or you could basically just read the serial data that went to the card and just play the same data back to turn your card back on. So what Sky did was, on the next version of the card, they had a date code, so it wouldn't listen to any packets of data if it had already seen a packet that had a later date code. So what you could do
if you wanted
If you figured out the hash
Yeah, next Wednesday.
let's say-
Yes.
if you figured out the hashing system, you could go to the very last date code possible for a card, turn on all the channels, and then no matter what Sky did, you couldn't turn that card off.
So
Because that date hadn't even arrived.
He's wicked, isn't he?
from about 1994 to 96.
That's video clip. Actually, Hirschler, who's the person who worked on the Sky encryption, is one of my friends on LinkedIn.
I remember that era very well. From 94 through 96 in Germany, I was one of the larger vendors of the BPSCs and the.
I got invited to something by Intel in Germany. What's that tower thing, the hacking, where the Chaos Computer Club meet?
I don't know.
Oh, well, you go down in floors, and the higher up in hacking, you go down, and Captain Crunch, when I went there one day,
John,
Captain
I know
Crunch
John
was
very well.
He was
Down in the
about 2
basement.
floors below us being interviewed.
Well-
But he used to do phone freaking at the same time he used to do phone freaking.
1 box, 2 box, red box, blue box. But during that time, I was making $452 every 2 weeks in the U.S. Army in Germany, and I drove a Porsche and an SVX and had a very nice house on Mannheimer Straße. From that card business.
Did you ever
so.
do the trick where you'd use the break tones for each of the different countries, and you go from one country to another, to the right back to your own country, and you go hello, and you go hello,
He knows already.
I used to carry the auto dialers that you could program, set up to do the, with the modified crystal would do the frequencies, and we'd get deployed someplace. I go upstairs, pay from, make my calls, and everything was like sorcery. So.
Wait, yeah, there's this other thing I can't really go in. I'll speak to you later.
They're outside waiting to arrest you now, Anton.
We'll maybe take one last question from the audience and then we'll wrap up. Yeah.
One for David. Apart from Batman the movie, can you name any other games that helped sell the Amiga and the 64, or you saw big spikes in sales?
I can't identify anything in particular, but I mean, in the UK, we kept the 64 selling well for 2 years beyond its really its use-by date, and that was by putting packs together. We did 2 packs every year, and it was just by being creative. For example, I did this pack for the 64 called Connoisseur Collection, and in that we had a mouse. We were one of the first computers ever with a mouse, and that was a product from Japan. Called Neos Mouse and Cheese. It was actually an art package that you drew using the mouse. You could do drawing with it, because we always, whatever we put into a pack, we always had some productivity software, a word processing art package and so on, because that justified the parents' purchase. We all know the kids wanted the games, that was what they wanted, but if you justify, the parent could say, this is for my child's better education. And that's the same thing when we did all the Amiga packs of Batman was the first one. But I think the Batman pack, it was resolutely, it wasn't the big, it was the first big seller. When you consider, and I have the absolute highest regard for Ocean, because when I went to them, they'd just come back from Hollywood having paid $1 million just for the rights to use the name Batman on their game. And I called them up and I said, look, I want to come and see you. I said, I've got an idea I want to throw at you, that you'll either have the balls to go with, or you'll send for the men in the wet coats to come and take me away, right? And they said, what do you want to do? And I said, right, I said, when Batman the movie game is finished, I want you to give it to me in my pack exclusively for 2 months. You can't sell it on its own over the counter. I want it for 2 months exclusively in the pack. I'm going to be putting a pack together which is selling Batman. The fact that there's an Amiga inside is incidental, because my philosophy is we don't sell computers, we sell dreams. Okay, so I said I want to have 2 months exclusively. I want to pay very little for it, and I only want to commit to 10,000 pieces. So they said, send for the men in the white coats. That's the first thing they said. And I said, David, we had a bit of a chat together, and they said, David, we got a couple of concerns. They said, we just paid $1 million, and we estimated it's going to cost us $1 million to make the game. So we've done calculations that how many we need to sell to get our money back and make a profit. And we're afraid that this number will be affected. They said, we're also afraid that our dealers are going to be upset. Anyway, I said, well, as far as the dealers being upset is concerned, I said, if this works, I said, they'll only be upset for a couple of days. Because if it works, they will be selling a £400 product instead of a £40 product. I know what I'd prefer to sell. Right? And anyway, I said, look, the other thing is that I've got a massive advertising budget compared to what you've got. But I'm putting that advertising budget to promote Batman. Anyway, the net result is that they had the balls to go with it, and I'm forever grateful for them for doing that. The net result is exactly as I predicted, 48 hours, and the dealers were laughing because they were selling a lot of packs. They ended up, they sold 5 times their highest estimate of the product on its own, 5 times more. And I didn't take 10,000 pieces from them, I took 186,000 pieces, because that's how many Amigas we sold in 12 weeks. Stunning. And that set the bar, because if you remember, after that, Sega and Nintendo, they all started doing bundles, but we did it all first. And we set the bar and we established that as a marketing activity.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, everyone, for watching. I'm sure we could have gone on for another hour at least, but can you join me, please, in thanking David Pleasance, Anthony Boyle, and of course, Colin Porch.